I can't see you raising your hands at home, but I'll be able to see a few raised hands here for those who are comfortable doing that. Some might not want to admit this, but I start with this question: how many of you have ever watched a show called Dancing with the Stars? It's a bold group. Some of the guys don't want to admit it, but I know that periodically, like me, haven't watched it a lot, but I've tuned in from time to time. For those of you who've never seen it, and I know I just said I haven't watched it much, but I can tell you, you love it. It's going to be back in September after 2 years off. I think my information is correct. For those of you who've never seen it, you don't know what it is. Here, in essence, is what Dancing with the Stars is, and I hope those of you who are here and online, you'll agree with this. I think I've got it, but here's what it is in essence. It's a show that takes people who've been very successful in entertainment, in sports, things like that. Some of you recognize really well, some you don't. But it's taken people like that and it has put them on display as dancers, seeing how they will do with that endeavor, new to them. And again, while this isn't something I've watched very much, I keep saying that, don't I? I'm not ashamed that I've seen it, but I have watched it enough to know that from time to time, you see total transformation, don't you? You see someone who has stumbled around when they were first out on the floor, you're thinking they're never going to get it, and then eventually, they get to the point where honestly, they move so gracefully, right? Y'all have seen that, those of you who've watched it. Now, as you watch that transformation, if you will, you begin to realize, okay, what's at the center of dancing, or what's fundamental to it, is very much so this: grace, right? Because with grace, dancing can be such a beautiful thing, but without it, hard to watch at times, right? Over the past 3 decades, and it just dawned on me this week, 3 decades, so I'm in my 30th year, or maybe I'm in my 31st. I guess I didn't do the math well enough. I think I'm heading into 31. But what a gift it's been. But over that many years, I've had a chance to be a part of many, many, many weddings. What a gift. Actually, I have one coming up in November. I have one coming up in December. Perfect time for not only the bride, but the groom to be here as well. Very, very fun. So I've been a part of many, many weddings, but therefore, what have I also been a part of? I've been a part of many, many, many wedding receptions, right? And in addition to other blessings that are found in a reception, particularly when people get a chance to share from the heart, they pay tribute, they raise a toast, all of that. You get to hear from some people oftentimes in that setting that you don't in a ceremony. In addition to that special part of a wedding reception, one of the joys of that time also is this: you get to see who can dance, right? And while there are some like me who don't bring much to that, a little bit of exercise, I do hope, though, that my wife will refute that when I get home. While there are some who don't bring a lot to it, there are also those who just glide across the floor in tandem with their spouse, in tandem with their date. And as you watch them again, you can't help but think, oh my goodness, what grace they are tapping into as they do that. While it's a different type of grace, we want to tap into a grace today that makes all the difference when it comes to, we might say, the dance of life. Again today, we turn to our series, Encountering Jesus. And as we do so, we want to take a look once again at one of Paul's letters, a letter that he wrote to some of the early churches, some that he helped to start. As we continue to understand better, to explore more deeply, okay, what does it mean for us to live out the encounter we've had with Jesus? As we continue to do that today, we're going to turn to another of his letters, that which is found in the book of, Josh, is it Galatians or Ephesians? Just kidding. We're going to turn to the book of Ephesians. Let me tell you, I'm the one who, though I had the book right, that emailed him, it's going to be chapter 1. So let's just be clear there. I had the book right, but not the chapter right. Today we turn to Ephesians, the passage that Lauren shared with us earlier. And before we go deeper into that, Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 10, let me just say a couple of things. One, we are turning there for this reason, because this particular passage has a lot to say about what life looks like when grace is present, but also what life looks like when grace is not present. Clumsy at best, but hopeless and meaningless at worst. Another thing, though, I want us to ponder as we move into this today, though, second chapter of Ephesians. I want us to also just lay a foundation for what this writing is built upon, what it springs out of. Because the context here is what's referred to as Paul's third missionary journey. And let me say more about that. 2 times before this, you probably guessed that, a first and second missionary journey. A couple of times before this, Paul has set out in order to share primarily with Gentiles the gospel of Jesus Christ. What is he wanting to see happen in the Gentiles' lives? What we're talking about in this series, he hopes that through what he shares, they might have a genuine encounter with Jesus. And so first off, we know that this is a part of this third missionary journey, sharing with Gentiles the gospel of Jesus Christ. But then another thing I want us to understand when it comes to this particular journey, this particular writing, I want us to also understand this, that as he stays there in Ephesus for 2 or 3 years, I mean, that seems like a long time, doesn't it? He's there for 2 or 3 years, and what's interesting is, while he is there, some really significant things happen. Some things that are really, really good, and some things that are really, really bad. For example, while Paul is there is this tremendous outpouring of the Spirit of God. It's incredible. Because of that, many miracles are done. Because of that, the church begins to expand greatly. It's amazing. At the same time, though, even as that is happening, have you found life sometimes bringing both? Sometimes even the more faithful we strive to be. At the same time, though, even as that is happening, this is also happening. Various plots against Paul are being carried out such that he barely escapes Ephesus alive. So imagine several years later, having experienced all of that, the good and the bad, imagine him several years later, his pen perhaps slowed by the chains that he's carrying. More than likely, he's in prison at that time. Imagine several years later now, Paul writing to his friends back in Ephesus in order to, more than anything else, just encourage them specifically as Gentile Christians. Now, while this letter is significant for a lot of reasons, and among all his letters, this one is indeed significant, there still are a few passages that most speak to what we're talking about today. And so today we turn our attention once again to one of those passages, what was read earlier. Let's go deeper now into Ephesians chapter 2, starting with verse 1. If you want to follow along, Ephesians 2, we'll start with verse 1. Notice these first few verses. As for you, Paul writes, and even with those first three words, Paul is setting up the encouragement that is to follow. He's setting up this sense of, man, look how far you've come. As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Now, just in those first three verses, we understand that all of them are wrapped up in one thing. What Paul shares with us toward the end of this first half of verse 3, when he offers up this Greek word sarx, when he uses that word sarx, translated flesh, when he does that, here's what he's talking about. He's talking about something within each and every one of us that says to us each day, not just before we have an encounter with Jesus Christ, but even after. This is something we always experience as human beings. The flesh is something that daily says to us, we need to primarily be concerned with what's in it for me. The flesh is something in our lives. The flesh is something that is, in essence, a voice that says we need to primarily be focused on, okay, how can I get my needs met? How can my comfort be attended to? In other words, the voice of the flesh within us is a very selfish voice, so to speak, a very self-focused thing in our lives. Martin Luther, to expand upon this, Martin Luther in his lecture on Romans says this, and it connects to Paul's point here. He writes, and I paraphrase only slightly, our nature, the human heart, is so deeply curved in on itself that it not only bends the best gifts of God towards itself and enjoys them, right? Not using them for others when we're caught in what? The flesh. Our nature, the human heart, is so deeply curved in on itself that it not only bends the best gifts of God toward itself and enjoys them, it's so deeply curved in on itself such that it also fails to realize it is seeking all things, even God, for its own sake. Again, what he's saying here, very similar to what Paul offers us in Ephesians. What he's saying here is this, that left to the flesh, we're going to always want life to be about us, right? A spouse who makes us happy, a friend who meets our needs, a coworker who values our opinion. Guys, when we are dominated by that flesh mindset, and even after an encounter with Christ, we're going to run into that at times. When we are dominated by that flesh mindset, we might call it, here's what we've got to realize. In the midst of that, Jesus is that alternate voice that is coming to us in a very strong way. When we're caught up in this flesh mindset, we've got to understand Jesus is coming to us each and every day, if we'll let his voice in, simply asking us this question: is this who we really want to be? You know, the world bowing down to us. And C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And these were wonderful books in my life growing up, and then things I shared with my kids Some of you who are online or some of you gathered here, they might be really special things to offer to children, offer to grandchildren. Perhaps some of you haven't heard of them before. But one of the books that comes along in C.S. Lewis's series, this Christian author who through the symbolism of these children's books is wanting to make the faith come to life. In one of his books called The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, in that book, he introduces a new character, Eustace Clarence Scrubb. To put it bluntly, Lewis tells us, Eustace is a selfish boy, a brat, and sometimes even a bully as well. And with that as his interior, we might say, with that being what's inside him, Lewis gets creative in this book by offering up a situation where his outside begins to match his inside. Here's how that occurs. One day when the ship he is on, the Dawn Treader, one day when the ship he is on arrives at a particular island, Eustace, not wanting to do any work, the work all of them had to do whenever the ship came into port, Eustace, not wanting to do any of that work, wanders away from the ship, finds a dragon's cave, and going into the cave, he soon falls asleep on the dragon's treasure, diamonds and rubies and jewels and gold. The problem is, when he wakes up, can you guess what he finds? When he wakes up, here's what he finds. He's turned into a dragon. The implication being that now his hard interior has become a scaly, hard exterior. Now, with that imagery, what Lewis is trying to tell us is this. With that transformation, here's what Eustace finds, that it's only when he begins to see on the outside what's going on the inside, only now can he, one, begin to realize how terrible he's been, but only then can he, two, begin to realize that's not who he wants to be. That's not how he wants to live. Again, what Lewis is trying to get at here, similar to Paul, similar to Luther, what he's trying to get at here is this, that when we see our inward life so caught up in the flesh, that it begins to manifest itself outwardly in incredibly awful and selfish ways. When that happens, what do we need to do? We got to yearn for, we've got to seek out that other voice, the voice of Christ, as that voice keeps asking us, is that who you really want to be? Notice what Paul says to that now in verses 3 through 10. Second half of verse 3 and then through 10. These words from earlier, let's go deeper into them now. Like the rest, we were, past tense, we were by nature deserving of wrath. Again, now, whenever we hear that other voice and we yearn for Jesus' voice, we move beyond the wrath and we move into what? Grace, what we're talking about today. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus, in order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, It is a gift from God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. You know, having addressed initially the power of the flesh, and it can be a force in our lives, again, lest we stand against it with God's help. Initially, having addressed the power of the flesh, Paul now does what? He addresses the power of God's grace, reminding us that if we'll allow that grace through our encounter with Jesus, he reminds us here, I want you to think of it this way. If we'll allow God's grace to touch our flesh, then what will happen for us primarily is this. What will change in us primarily is this. The voice we're mostly listening to. No more listening to that voice of the flesh just saying over and over, you got to lean on what's in it for me. Instead, now, having allowed that grace to touch the flesh, now the voice we consistently listen to is the voice of Christ asking us now each day, how can we this day give our lives for others even as he has given his life for us? I want you to think about an experience that you've had in your life where you really felt that. And I really believe some of us might say, boy, that hasn't happened very often. But I know it's happened for you at least a few times. I want you to think of an experience like that you've had where in that moment, in that interaction, in that time with another, all you felt welling up within you was this: how can I set my needs aside for their needs, as Jesus has done for me? Just welled up within you in very real ways in that moment. How can I give my life for them as Jesus gave his life for me? At the center of it all, when you experience that with God's help, at the center of that all was what we started with today, right? Grace, simple as that. As you felt led in that moment to simply offer to another the grace that you had so generously received from God. The bottom line is this: Jesus hasn't just saved us by grace. He's called us to be a people of grace, because in the end, that's our true identity. Claim that today. That's our true identity as followers of Jesus, to be those who bestow grace upon others, to be those who are constantly thinking, my life for yours. I'll tell you what, whether or not you can dance gracefully, I know that you can, in fact, if you but choose this as a follower of Jesus, I know that you can, in fact, live life gracefully, or live a life that is graceful, full of grace. If that is, as one who's had an encounter with Christ, you'll catch yourself listening to the voice of the flesh, and you'll strive in those moments to listen to Jesus' voice, calling you all the while to embrace your true identity, to be people of grace. It is great to be with you today. We'll be talking about deep joy next week. But for now, I pray that you might just claim what we've embraced today out of Ephesians.